The Quarterly, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Lesson 2, 1 Corinthians 3, Building the Temple. One of the issues in the Corinthian church that Paul had addressed in his opening chapter was divisions in the church. Some were claiming to be followers of Paul, while others followers of Apollos or Peter, and yet others took a supposedly superior position of claiming merely to be followers of Christ. 1 Corinthians 1:12. But the result of the elevation of human leaders, or even the supposed elevation of Christ, was that there were destructive divisions within the church. The leaders of these factions claimed superiority over other factions, as if their group was more spiritually mature. Yet these divisions were themselves evidence of widespread immaturity in the church, along with a failure to grasp the nature of the church and the role of her leaders. And Paul addresses these failures in 1 Corinthians 3. The Corinthian church was a church of remarkable gifts, as Paul acknowledges in his greeting in chapter 1, verse 5. They were proud of their spirituality. Yet spiritual gifting and spiritual maturity are not the same. And of the two, maturity is far more important to the health of the church. Paul lays down a basic contrast of spiritual and worldly, literally being of the flesh, in people's thinking, by which to gauge Christian maturity. Verse 3. The Corinthians were believers, so Paul could address them as brothers and sisters, verse 1. But they were baby Christians who needed to be fed spiritual milk rather than spiritual meat, basic teaching rather than advanced teaching, because they were not ready for the latter, verse 2. It is possible to have the Spirit and be saved, while at the same time continuing to act as though you were still of this world, exhibiting thinking that is unrenewed by the Spirit, as Paul reminds us in Romans 12:2. The evidence of the Corinthians' worldly rather than spiritual thinking lay in the jealousy and strife that racked their assembly, in which they were placing all their focus on human personalities rather than on spiritual truth. Verses 3 and 4. Compare Galatians 5, verses 19 to 21. That same worldly thinking will be exposed later in the epistle in their acceptance of sexual immorality and idolatry. In elevating their own faction and leader, people were elevating themselves by proxy. Factionalism in the church was driven by pride and a desire to be acknowledged as right, not by a desire for the truth and to see Jesus elevated over all. Jealousy and strife are long-standing problems in the church. Even Jesus' first disciples were not immune. James and John came to Jesus seeking the highest places in God's kingdom for themselves. Mark 10, 35 to 45. And Jesus rebuked them, implicitly rebuking the other disciples for their angry reaction to James and John's request, by pointing to the fundamental difference between leadership in God's kingdom and leadership in the world. Mark 10, 42 to 44. Leaders in God's kingdom are servants, not lords. Humility, not exaltation, marks the pathway of those whom Jesus calls to follow him. Mark 10:45. And it's this pathway to maturity that Paul lays out here. Paul highlights the humble role that he and Apollos played in the establishing of the Corinthian church, using various metaphors to drive that point home. Using an agricultural metaphor, Paul planted the seeds and saw them sprout as the first caretaker of the Christian community there. Apollos subsequently watered the plants, continuing that caretaking process. But neither planting the seeds nor watering them had any power to give those seeds life. That life and growth came from God himself, verses 6 and 7. What's more, the planter and the waterer were self-evidently not on opposing teams, but together form part of the larger farming project. planting and watering were not tasks undertaken by the owner of the field, but by farm servants, the lowest rung on the social spectrum. The workers received wages for their work in service of God, but the field remained God's field, not their own personal domain. Verse 9. God is both the master of the entire church and the one whose power gives it life. Paul then shifts his metaphor to the more complex image of constructing a building. He laid the foundation of the building, and now others are raising the walls and the roof to complete the house. 1 Corinthians 3:10. Paul's emphasis on the sole proper foundation, Jesus Christ, reminds us that divisions in the church are not always problematic. Sometimes they're necessary to defend foundational truths. 1 Corinthians 11:19. If someone is trying to shift the church onto a different foundation, they need to be resisted strenuously, as Paul demonstrates in his letter to the Galatians. However, once that solid foundation has been laid, there is room for a variety of builders to construct the building upon it, using a variety of different materials. Verse 12. Now, not all of those building materials are of equal value. Gold, silver, and precious stones are clearly better things to build out of than wood, hay, or straw. Verse 13. On the day of judgment, the quality of that work will be tested with fire. The best materials will survive the test, while inferior materials will be burned up. Some work is of lasting value because it is more in keeping with the nature of the foundation, the crucified Christ, while other work may be based on worldly wisdom, at least in part, rather than on the wisdom of God, and so it will not endure. There will be rewards for faithful builders, based on the quality of their work, which includes the motives of their hearts, as well as the actions of their lives. See 1 Corinthians 4, verse 5. While less faithful builders will see much of their work consumed, verses 14 to 15. Providing the work is built on the solid rock of Christ, however, the loss of the inferior superstructure does not mean a loss of salvation for the builder, verse 15. The fire represents purification, not destruction. The mention of rewards for the builders might seem like a shift in focus, but it's related to Paul's main point. The Corinthians' factionalism revolved around human assessments of the relative value of the work of the church leaders, whether Paul or Apollos was building with gold and silver or wood and stubble. But Paul's words about rewards remind us that only on the last day will the true nature of the building work be tested and then revealed. We are not always good judges of the nature of the building work of our leaders. Indeed, even the leaders themselves cannot always rightly judge their own work. See 1 Corinthians 4, verses 3 and 4. God will be our judge, whether we are leaders or followers. The two themes of farm and house come together in the image of God's temple, which from Eden onwards has had aspects of a garden, where God dwells in the midst of his people. It's not that the Corinthians individually are God's temples, but rather that as the church, they formed a single temple indwelt by God's Spirit. The you in 1 Corinthians 3:16 is plural. As such, they represent a holy space, and must strive to maintain the sanctity of their assembly by avoiding anything that would profane it. See chapter 6, verses 19 to 20. But they must also strive to maintain the body's unity as a reflection of that temple identity. See chapter 12, verses 13 to 14. To tear the church apart into various factions is to tear apart God's house, an act of rebellion against him that deserves fearsome judgment, verse 17, similar to the judgment pronounced on the sexually immoral person in chapter 5, verses 4 and 5. The Corinthians thought they were wise, but they were actually fools, because what they valued was the wisdom of this world. Since the Lord brings the wisdom of this world to nothing, To trust in human wisdom is to trust in insubstantial vanity. Indeed, to pit one human leader over against another and boast in their accomplishments is to diminish the Christian life. We don't have to choose between Paul and Apollos and Peter, Cephas. We can learn from all of them, insofar as their unique teaching reflects the common foundation of Christ crucified. Verse 22. Paul's point here contradicts a common way of thinking about worldly and spiritual perspectives. Worldly wisdom likes to portray itself as broad and open to benefit from many different points of view, while it depicts spiritual wisdom as narrow and world-denying. But perspectives that are out of accord with the wisdom of God, as the creator of this material world, cannot possibly bring us true understanding. God's wisdom teaches us to enjoy everything that is good, noble, and lovely about the world that he has created. Philippians 4:8. It urges us to receive God's good gifts, while remembering that we belong to Christ, and are called to glorify God by our holy lives. Chapter 6, verse 20. Even Jesus, though equal with God, subjected himself to divine wisdom in his mission to earth, building his church to the glory of the Father. See Philippians 2, verses 5 to 11. Application questions. 1. What does spiritual immaturity look like? How can you grow out of it? 2. Why is the metaphor of a temple so relevant for the church? 3. How does worldly wisdom infect the church in our day? 4. How does Jesus show us what true wisdom looks like?